Well, thanks to the Food Packaging Forum for inviting me today. And it's been a very interesting day so far, and quite a few of the points that I'm going to make have been made before. I think my talk is going to be slightly more political than some of the others, because I'm allowed to say political things, whereas a lot of the other speakers aren't. So I might as well take the advantage. I'm not going to do Trump, no. We've got enough trouble in Europe and in the UK. So addressing of chemicals of concern in food contact, particularly recycled materials. So I'm going to do an introduction to CHEM Trust, a bit about the EU regulation, since unfortunately we're missing a commission speaker, some of the holes and problems, many of which have been raised in some way today, a bit of pizza boxes, because they're very trendy these days, how to get action, which I think is a big question, and some conclusions. So on CHEM Trust is a charity. We work mainly at EU level on chemicals, but we are actually UK based. And it's about humans and wildlife from harmful chemicals, and it's particularly about endocrine disruptors. But we work a lot on the regulatory systems to make sure that something actually happens. So we work with scientists, we work with technical processes, decision makers, and we work with other civil society groups like Lisette and HEAL. Focusing on the endocrine disrupting chemicals, which you've heard quite a bit about today. We have a blog which we try to keep up to date with what's going on, and we have Twitter as well to try and get that. And we aim to try and make that interface between science and policy and people actually understanding what's going on at the policy level. So if we look at the EU regs, this has been mentioned, you've got a key regulation from 2004 on materials and articles intended to come into contact with food. And as has been mentioned, we've got this general safety requirement, which talks about the importance of not endangering human health. It's probably worth saying that this is the same time that REACH was coming through. So one of the reasons why REACH and this law don't necessarily interact entirely logically is because they were actually going through the legislative process at a similar time. That law also included the idea of more detailed daughter legislation. There was a list of about 17 different sorts of food contact materials, and a handful have been done, the biggest being plastic materials and articles intended to come into contact with food. So if you look at what someone like EFSA does, the European Food Safety Agency, they spend a lot of their time in this area looking at plastic-related chemicals. So you can go to their website, there's huge amounts of stuff, but unless you realize that they're not talking about paper and card and inks, it's not obvious, because they don't really say up front, by the way, we don't cover these. So there's no EU harmonized regulations for paper, ink, coatings, adhesive, and board, and a few other things. So I was thinking about floating a new abbreviation of PICAB, or you could do BACIP if you wanted to. But, so it's quite a big deal. We would say it's a system full of holes. We have the positive union list of chemicals used in plastic food contact materials, and that's risk assessed by EFSA, and we can discuss elements of that, but at least it's there. But there's no EU level list of safety assessed chemicals for PICAB materials, and nor is there in most member states. Different member states have different systems, but we've got 28 countries here in the EU, and I'm not sure how good the Polish or Romanian or Italian systems are. I know that the Germans are good on paper, and the Swiss, who aren't in the EU, are very good on ink. But it's a bit of a strange system. And I think recycling is an interesting example, because there is a regulation which means that if you're going to recycle plastic into food contact material, you actually have to get the process approved. So there are plants where they are recycling PET bottles or HDPE bottles into new bottles, but those processes have been approved by an EFSA scientific committee. But there's nothing equivalent for looking at processes to recycle paper and card into a new food contact material, like, for example, pizza boxes. And this is the same in member states. And as has been mentioned, I think very, very interestingly, different member states or associated countries like Switzerland had different rules on what can be done with recycled materials, lots of recycled paper. And even people quite immersed in the issue don't necessarily know exactly which country has which rules. And you do have the problem that from a government regulatory point of view, the human health risks of those chemicals in the PICAB materials are largely unregulated. So individual companies may be making their efforts, but there will always be best of sector and worst of sector companies. There has to be someone who's actually in charge of overlooking that. And it's very important to say that when you have REACH, which is about industrial chemicals in general, there is expressly in REACH, when a chemical is registered with a chemical safety report, it doesn't need to cover chemical use in food contact material, the human health risks of that use. It can cover it, doesn't say you can't, but it says you don't need to. And the authorization process, which has been mentioned, is expressly forbidden for the authorization process to address human health risks of chemicals in food contact. REACH does have a restriction process which can annihilate everything. It doesn't often, but it could. And that can be used against food contact. But these aren't the only problems. There is the lack of this logical overlap between the REACH system of chemicals and food contact materials. So a chemical can be identified as a substance of very high concern in REACH, going into your authorization system, but there's no automatic action in EFSA on the plastic side, or certainly not for any other material. So it's identified as a problem, it has a hazard that's problematic, but nothing is done. And there's a lack of effective link between the data gathering within the REACH system and the food contact materials. So REACH is getting huge amounts of data. That data does not necessarily go to EFSA to update it, and the other way around. And we did a workshop, CHEM Trust organized a workshop earlier this year, which several people here were at, to try and look at what could be done to integrate these two together. And there's quite a lot of sensible stuff that could be done if it was wanted. And then there's these big scientific and technical challenges, the NIAS that's already been discussed, and the mixtures issues. You know, this is the reality. They're not just theoretical questions. And I think then there's enforcement. I mean, when there are rules, particularly when they're quite vague, it's very difficult to enforce them. And we know that public sector are being cut in many countries. And if you don't have enforcement, you don't reward those who are doing a good job. And I've had people coming to me from an industry, the carton industry, saying, we use low migration inks, we do this, we do that, but we know there are other people in the sector who are not doing that. And we know that in the UK, the Food Standards Agency just looks at supermarket cereals every couple of years and they don't even prosecute anyone then. So, you know, you can produce cheaper materials and sell them to cheaper shops and to be bought by poorer people, and you're confident that no one will ever find you out, essentially. So we have a regulatory system that works for the people buying the more expensive products and not for those buying poorer products, which is a bit dodgy. Pizza boxes. Pizza boxes are made from recycled paper card. That seems to be assumed in some countries and not others. And we have the problems from recycling. We've got the ink, the glue, the paper, the coatings from the recyclate. And has been mentioned, there's Danish research finding bisphenol A, phthalates, mineral oils, non-alphenol, and how did that get there? And perfluorocarbons. Now, perfluorocarbons are interesting because, of course, they may be deliberately being used. They are used in plastic materials. They break down into persistent pollutants, have all sorts of exciting effects on the immune system and others, and we're going to be dealing with them for centuries because they're not going to go away. Just on bisphenol A, we've mentioned it a few times. It's a very interesting chemical, found to be endocrine disrupting in 1938 in a seminal paper. It's banned in baby bottles in the EU, but it's used at the moment in most thermal paper till receipts. And that gets into the recycled paper scheme, because most people will recycle their till receipts. And that's one of the ways it will presumably get into the pizza boxes. So how would you solve that from a circular economy point of view? You could tell the public, we want you to recycle paper, but not till receipts. And then the public would just get confused, and it's just not worth it. I think that's the general approach. I don't recycle till receipts, but most people do. You could restrict BPA use in thermal paper, and the EU is doing that. Still going to be another 2 years before it comes out, and there's still the alternatives, but it is happening. Or you could regulate recycled paper use in food contact. And again, that's not there yet. So it's not a pretty picture, and I think the public would be very surprised about what we talk about. It has very low public profile. They expect the EU and governments to provide protection, and the fact that it's not under control is a potential scandal in the future, even if it's not visible at the moment. And the lack of regulation and investigation means we're only seeing a tip of the iceberg. And the European Parliament, as was mentioned, has done a very good detailed report on improvements needed, but we want to know, is anything going to change? So we produced a briefing on the subject, and we've been pushing away, as have others. This is our briefing. I've got a few copies here. We've got a similar one on circular economy in general. And we do want a harmonized system. We want substitution of SVHCs and EDCs, and we want assessment of NIAS. But what's happening? The key thing is the European Commission is in charge of any changes. They have to initiate the legislation, often after pressure from member states. But there's been no commitment yet for the Commission to act. They're going to publish a review by the Joint Research Centre, which should again show that the system doesn't work. Why isn't there any action? At a guess, I would say DG Santé, where it has to be done from, is understaffed. You know, there were essentially 3 people who could have spoken at this event, and none of them were available in the end. So that's not very many people. Clearly EFSA does the technical stuff, but Santé has to develop the new policy. It's not a priority for the Commission as a whole, and the Commission has a real stamping down on priorities these days. If it was, then it would get extra resources. And then there's all the debate about better regulation and whether that means deregulation or doing nothing or whatever. Is there anyone lobbying against it? We don't really know. People tend to say they want it, but you never know. There might be parts of the chemical industry who don't want it. So pressure's needed. We got the European Parliament vote, but there is more than that we can do, I think. So to conclude, I think firstly, we would say it's not an acceptable situation, neither from the public point of view or from the industry. And I do consistently hear industry voices saying they want harmonisation. We need protective EU harmonised regulation of all chemicals in food contact, including recycled materials. And we do have this situation where EU law says we should recycle more and more packaging, but then we don't control the safety of that packaging if it's paper, which is perverse. So how do you get action? Here's my 3 options in order of preference. The first is the Commission decides to act. They say, maybe even in the next few weeks, they say, okay, Commission Work Programme 2017, we're going to work forward on this, we're going to do some coloured paper, we're going to develop something. And they could do that. Different people in this room, as far as I can tell, have different views on how likely that is. That's the easy option, essentially. Not so easy for the Commission, but they have to do the work in the end anyway. The second one is national governments disrupt the internal market through national controls. So let's say Denmark, to choose a random country, decides to really regulate perfluorocarbons in paper and says these are our laws, and that actually starts to disrupt, say, some multinational takeaway operations. Then the Commission would have to act because they don't like the internal market being disrupted. And the final option is that we have scandals, public pressure on governments and companies, and then the Commission has to act. And I'm not saying that's the most preferable one, but that could be where we end up if we don't get the ones above to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.